so we have finished part one. We're now moving on to part two, unmasking the structures of power. So I teach this class, basically I've been teaching it every fall. And last fall, this is a year ago, if you can imagine 1 year ago, when none of this was happening. That wall was closed off, and I asked people, what about this? What does unmasking mean to you? Because I started thinking about like Halloween and stuff, and I didn't know if unmasking made any sense. This is what Guest calls it, unmasking the structures of power. But everybody assured me that we were all okay on unmasking. But now, a year later, I am very convinced that we need to change this unmasking thing because we are not unmasking anything. Masks on. So instead of unmasking, we are going to call this exposing the roots of the structures of power, because, man, I don't want to get into any mask debates here. Too many of those. So exposing the roots of the structures of power, and now maybe you'll see why I was using that quote from one of my favorite anthropologists and mentors. That picture was from happier days. He's now passed away, unfortunately. But what Trouillot was saying was the ultimate mark of power may be its invisibility. So you know you have a very powerful structure or system going on when nobody knows it's there, when you can't figure out what's going on and you're just kind of lost in it just is assumed to be natural. It's assumed to be the way things are. Then you know you really got a powerful structure going on. The ultimate challenge, and I think he's challenging us or people who want to expose the powerful system, the exposition of its roots. So exposing the roots of power, making it visible, unmasking it, as Guest said, but like I said, not using that phrase anymore. So going back to the exposition of the roots of power. Now, before we do that, I want to go back a little bit into what we just did. So part one of the course. We began with what is anthropology, although I'm filling in here and saying what is cultural anthropology in the United States, which is really what we're after. And although Guest talks about cultural anthropology as a toolkit for a global age, in some ways, he is really talking about cultural anthropology in the United States as it is practiced. He doesn't draw that much from other parts of cultural anthropology. So basically, we did what is U.S. cultural anthropology. We talked about culture. We talked about the primary method of fieldwork and ethnography. And we talked about language. Now, one of the things that is really important to understand in the emergence of anthropology in the United States is how all of those things were originally deployed against a structure of race and racism in the United States, or against that idea of a hierarchical ethnocentrism that would rank all of the world's peoples and rank all of the peoples in American society in such a way that certain peoples were at the bottom and certain peoples were at the top. And so when Franz Boas and others were initiating this anthropological study about 150 years ago, this was really the backdrop into which they were deploying or they were exercising some of these ideas. And their sort of main take on this was to introduce us to the idea of cultural relativism and linguistic relativism. So against the structure which would have us believe that race as biology determined our existence, they deployed the idea that culture was why we were different from each other, and that you had to understand each culture on its own terms. Not that all cultures were equally valid or equally good, but that you had to understand them, those patterns from within, and you couldn't automatically rank them. You had to understand them on their own terms. The same thing with what we were just studying last week with language and the idea of linguistic relativism, that languages could not be necessarily ranked in terms of their complexity, and that each language was itself a system of beautiful world, a world unto itself. And so this was, as we've talked about, this is a pretty radical idea. We talked about how each of these things sort of got deployed in a radical way. So in order to talk about culture as against those ideas of racial determinism, that was a pretty big deal. However, we also talked about how those very ideas then get transformed into a different way of thinking about things, which is that culture becomes determining in and of itself. I think this was when we started talking about American gun culture, it became clear that that had a sort of double edge to it. On the one hand, maybe it was good because people were like, well, that's not biological. But on the other hand, it made it sound like something good or something that could never be changed or something that was rooted in these deep traditions. Same thing with field work. We talked about your own field work and how in some ways it'd be hard to convince other people that that was good field work because we're convinced that field work has to be way far away or in an exotic place. And then finally with language. And so I was happy that so many of you appreciated. I do love this video with Lyra Boroditsky. She's not technically an anthropologist, but she kind of plays one on TV, claiming her as our rock star here. You know, and a lot of you were very completely convinced that she was convincing us of the value of other languages. And certainly when you're talking about, you know, people that can orient themselves and know where north is all the time, I mean, it's really interesting stuff, right? One of you did pick up what has always made me grimace when I show the video, which is that then there's those languages that they don't seem to be able to count, where it goes from 1, 2 to many, you know, and you're like, are those people going to be able to make it in the modern world? They can't count, man. They can't do math. That's messed up. So I think that there's a sort of lingering suspicion there that, hey, wait a second. I don't know if these people, these non-number people are going to make it. So I really wish it would be very easy for her to add that, you know what, if you grow up in one of these languages, you can very easily add on a counting language. It's not that hard. You know, go to school, learn some 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's not a big deal. It's not going to set you back. So, I mean, again, and with the idea that, you know, I think because of our American experience, we believe that most of the world is monolingual. Truth of the matter is, most of the world grows up with more than one language as a primary, or, you know, they're multilingual from the beginning. So even if your primary language didn't have a numbering system, it'd be very easy to add this on. This is not a big deal in terms of your mental or cognitive capability. So I wish you would have mentioned it, because I think it leaves us with this suspicion that, you know, hey, there's people out there that can't count. But anyway, it's a good catch. It always makes me a little weirded out to show that video. Like I said, I'm glad that most of you thought she did a good job. I do too, but, you know, one of those things. So, the next part is really about what happened, or how exactly anthropology was put into the world. We talked about this sort of culture fieldwork language. So, like I said, there was, you know, culture out there, or the way in which people apprehended the idea of culture. It was accepted, and people started talking about people as having different culture and their culture. But mainly it began, you know, it began to acquire these same characteristics as being these little isolated, bounded units that we're sealed off from each other. And so in exactly the same way that we think about languages as, oh, there are 7,000 languages in the world, and Boroditsky's forthcoming book is supposed to be titled 7,000 Universes. So the idea is that each of these languages composes a whole separate universe. You know, this idea that there's 7,000 cultural universes out there. And in a lot of ways, when people started talking about culture, it almost became the opposite of what it was intended, in the sense that it became an excuse. It made power invisible. Now, what do I mean by that? So we've been seeing it, and you know, we should probably we'll talk maybe more about this on Wednesday, for example. You know, we've been seeing protests against police killings, the prominence of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, one could look at this and say, as we should, that this is an example of inequality and power in US society. But you can imagine people looking at it and saying, oh, aha, that's just, you know, African-American culture of belligerence, or they're feisty culturally. And if we do that, then we are able to discount any sort of relationship of power that's going on in society. And this happens, you know, it can happen with sort of what we might consider good aspects of culture as well as bad aspects of culture. This becomes an excuse. And so you sort of discount the ideas of history, of interconnectedness, and of power differentials by just saying, hey, it's their culture. So that's what I think happened sort of out there in the world. And we've talked a lot about that, so we'll leave that for now. Within the university system, or academia, or the researchers, we might say, I think a lot of people like Trouillot and other anthropologists, and we talked about things like hegemony and different forms of power and all these sophisticated, increasingly sophisticated ideas. So here we were trying to expose the roots of power, do the exposition of the roots of power. And even, you know, even when I use the phrase exposition of the roots, which is what Trouillot was talking about, it strikes me as how many syllables those words have. Exposition, you know, that's already a pretty long word there. You could just say exposing the roots of power, maybe. I don't know why you have to do an exposition of it. And nobody cared. As one of you mentioned in the comments, anthropology is trying to say some stuff about power and race and racism, but nobody's really listening because it's just a few people in a classroom and a few people in block boxes out there, and you know, the message was not sort of accepted in the popular sphere. And I was happy because on my last time I talked about this, I did use the word in a forest with no one around. You know, that idea that if you're clap in the forest, a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear, does it really even happen? But now I get a great little extension of the metaphor of the roots, because now I'm digging up the roots of power and nobody's even around to see me doing the digging. And in anthropology was once sort of known for being a kind of lightning rod discipline when it came to the issues of race and racism. So, you know, Boas was, I mean, even still to this day, when people bring up Boas's study of measuring the heads of immigrants and the body form of immigrants, and how he argued that in the next generation, they changed biologically, even though they hadn't intermarried with anyone in the United States, that there were biological changes that happened just because of their environment. People still get crazy about that idea. So Boas was a lightning rod. Some people think that Margaret Mead may have invented the term racism. Not sure about that one. but sometimes she's credited with it. Martin Luther King Jr. quotes anthropologists in some of his writings. And so, anthropology is once sort of seen as the discipline to go to on these issues. But then, you haven't seen us around. I don't think we've been quoted lately. Not too many anthropologists show up to be quoted on, hey, what's this? What are they doing? What's the Black Lives Matter movement about? Do you come to anthropologists? Usually not. So we've tended to fade out in terms of our message. I guess I've just been talking about the last year, but let's fast forward. So this is what kind of happens up until around the year 2000, around the year of your being born. So in the decades of 2000 to 2010, 2000, 2020, one of the things that happens is all of a sudden people are swabbing themselves for DNA and saying, well, I'm 16% this and 27% that. And also people came out with the idea that there were pills to treat certain ailments that were more prevalent in different racial groups. And what this meant was it linked the idea of race to money. And we sort of talked about this when we talked about the idea of language and gender and how it was easier to sell books to people if they, believed that it wasn't male-female inequalities that they were ruining their marriage, but some sort of cultural thing, and that they could self-help that thing. Same thing in a little bit in this way. It became lucrative to sell people on the notion of heritage. Even, I think last year, there was when the World Cup was playing, they were running these 23andMe ads that say, which World Cup team should you support? Send in your DNA and we'll tell you where you're from. So that kind of stuff, it's linked to this idea of money. And I think that this has always been the case in American politics, but certainly it is much more obvious now that race and politics, that's one way to sort of incite different kinds of feelings and explicitly draw on race in order to fuel your political power and your political position. So as we'll see with ethnicity, when things get linked up to money and to power and people are able to exploit those things, they often become more powerful in society. The other thing that really happened is that anthropologists and others argued that race is a social construction, or race is socially constructed. And I guess that argument was crazily misunderstood. What people took that argument to mean was that there wasn't any physical or biological differences between people. And so people mocked anyone who said that. What are you talking about? Just look at them. They're so different. People are different. You tell me you can't see the difference? And I guess one of you noted the interesting work that John Marks does on, he said, well, what if we took some kids and told them to sort blocks by size, or sort blocks by color, or sort blocks by shape? And the point is that if you sort by color, you'll get certain groups. And if you sort by shape, you'll get other groups. And if you sort by size, you'll get other groups. And that's really been the point all along that anthropologists were making, not that everybody was the same. We didn't believe that everybody was the same color. We didn't even believe that everybody was the same biologically speaking, but that our categories were formed by society. And so, if you had different sorting mechanisms, you're going to get different categories. So, that was kind of the point of that. This was, again, wildly misunderstood it became more of a source of kind of mockery than of anything else. The other thing that was probably true is that anthropologists believed that if we could just convince everyone, if we could just show them how race was socially constructed, then the problems of society would go away, which was equally naive, right? So the idea was if we could just educate people, then social problems will go away. Well, the social problems did not go away, as we may know. So while anthropologists and others were talking about the idea that race is socially constructed, and we're hoping to educate people and make them less prejudiced and more tolerant, at the same time, people were sorting themselves out, you might say, by wealth, by geography, and ultimately by race. So that, you know, yes, we had a Supreme Court ruling back in the day, Brown v. Board of Education, that would technically desegregate our schools. How is it that even after that, our schools are almost, if not as segregated as they were 50 or 60 years ago? Well, a lot of that has to do with wealth, accumulated wealth, the wealth that is passed along, where people can live, and that many people end up living in de facto gated communities that, you know, are very racially and wealth segregated. This is called, we haven't read this yet, but this is what Guest calls institutional racism. It's the structuring of society so that society basically ends up being, the institutions end up reinforcing the racist structure. At the same time, many people, many white people, believed that racism was over, that we fixed all that maybe back in the 1960s. Or if we hadn't fixed it all, we fixed most of it. And there's the idea. And in fact, some people, some whites thought racism was more than over. And there's this whole idea that, you know, oh, now, you know, black people are getting all the advantages, you know, affirmative action, etc. And so, you know, the idea was that, I mean, it kind of baffles my mind, but it's one of the reasons that 2016 happened. The idea was that somehow whites had become disadvantaged in society, that they were on the bottom of things. I can't quite understand that. But that was the idea that was out there. And one of the reasons that, that people thought racism was over, white people, was because racism got defined to them, to us, as individual racism. So instead of talking about the institutional or the societal or the structural racism, people considered racism to be attitudes, beliefs, if you said certain words, if you had certain thoughts. That was said to be racism. And so people would use racist as a kind of accusatory slur. This is happening all the time now, right? So, you know, whether or not someone is racist is said to be some sort of inner belief system or some kind of weird feeling that they have. Whereas, you know, I mean, how to say, I'm not quite so interested in weird feelings. I'm interested in the social structure that is enabling certain people to use those feelings or to use that structure to their advantage. So I actually updated this a little bit. I think that in the last 3 months or so, there are a lot more people who now realize that the, you know, some of the racism that we thought was over is still here. It took a long time, but, you know, I think even those attitudes can change a little bit. All right, so I don't want to explicitly talk about the way in which anthropology approaches race today, what we have to say about it, first from a kind of biological point of view. We're just going to, in this class, we're going to dwell on the idea of race and how it is constructed. In the next class, we're going to talk a lot more about racism and the way in which that reinforces race. So, as Gus tells us at the beginning of the chapter, and this was hugely important to me from chapter 1, that's why I asked you to write about it in relationship to the Nakirema, is that, you know, migrating, mixing of peoples, talking to each other, trading things, mating, has been something that we have been doing since the beginning. This is not some sort of new activity that started happening 20 years ago. This is something that has been happening for thousands, hundreds of thousands, I'm not sure if I'm going to say millions, many years. And what is produced is a series of variations in humans which are called clinal, which is to say that most human variation is continuous over a geographical area. So humans are varied. I'm not going to tell you that those 3 people on the screen all look the same. They don't. And certain variations tend to start to clump up in some geographical areas. But as you walk across those areas, they change gradually from population to population. Now this gets a little bit funny when people start flying around or sailing around to different places, especially across the oceans. But in terms of how we look at the kind of geographical structure of human variation, it's often very gradual or along a cline. We also know that variations don't all go together as a single package. This is kind of something that Mendel taught us with those pea plants and Punnett squares, that, you know, you could combine different kinds of things. And, you know, I mean, sometimes there's some genetic linkages, but having one particular skin tone doesn't even say how much, it doesn't say much about the width of your nose, for example. And so, you know, some people have tried to link up various characteristics, and that's really what the idea of race is that somehow having a certain one type of physical characteristic is also going to say something about other types of physical characteristics, or something about your intelligence, or something about your athletic ability, or, you know, all those kinds of things. Whereas we know from genetics that a lot of these things just sort and combine independently. Even things like hair color. So, you know, I mean, if we sort of sample the world's populations, you know, there are people in Aboriginal Australia who also have blonde or reddish hair. So even those kinds of things don't always go together in the way we sometimes imagine they do in the United States. And so I think the, you know, drawing from what I've read of the biological anthropologists is actually something I borrowed from John Relaford, who teaches at SUNY Oneonta. You know, that race is an attempt to describe real variation, or I don't even know if it's an attempt, it's a classification scheme. And what Relaford is saying is, there is real variation. It's not that people don't vary, but it doesn't help us very much. It's a pretty sort of crude first approximation that doesn't really tell us that much biologically about the people we're describing. So I think, as I said in the web comment, I'm not that interested in dealing today with the kind of biological aspects of this. I just want to sort of put that out there. If you're interested in this, you should, of course, take biological anthropology, and they'll do more. This is the world. And there's people who measure skin color variation and have like 50 different numbers to talk about, you know, different skin color variation shades. And one of the important things to realize, because we get really hung up on skin color, is there is no for one thing, if you lined up all the people of the world and their skin color variation, there's no clear boundaries between any groups. There's not any lines that you could draw. It's a continuous clinal variation from the lightest to the darkest. So we assign numbers to it, but as you can see, there's like, 50 numbers there, or 30. And my middle-aged eyes are dying out. But it's not something that there's like 5 categories of skin color. There's in fact a continuous range there. And what Guest says on page 126, and I dwell here a little bit on this just because it tripped a couple of you up on the quiz. I want to be clear that if you walked from Russia to Africa, or from Sweden to South Africa, if you walked all that way, and again, I'm going to say before people traveled transoceanically, if you walked all that way, of course, at the northern extremes and the southern extremes, you're going to see very different types. But there would be no place where you say, okay, I've crossed a river, or I've crossed a track, or I've crossed a village, and now I'm in a different skin tone. Obviously there's going to be subtle differences, but there's no sort of boundary line between the dark and the white, or the brown and the black. It's all continuous variation along that walk. And that walk basically describes, different adaptations to tropical and northern climes, both in terms of vitamin D absorption, and also, of course, in terms of sun repellent, natural sun repellent of the skin. So what happens with that gradual variation? The notion of race that we live with today is both old, in the sense that it comes to us from 500 to 600 years ago, or maybe 300 to 600 years ago. So depending on how you want to look at it, that's either really old, or it's, in other ways, it could be said to be relatively recent. That is to say, this is something that happened relatively recently in human history, that we started breaking people into 5, 6, 45, whatever number of categories. Certainly, people in the old days, in the even older pre-colonial days, talked about physical differences. It's not that people didn't. It's just the idea that people came as 5 sets is a relatively recent experience. What I mean by relatively recent is within the last 300 years or so. Again, but that's where we get these ideas about race. And so we get our ideas about race from the colonial experience, in which certain people sailed across the world in order to be, kind of try to be on top of things, and imported other people from different places of the world, enslaved them, and brought people together into new environments in which, that clinal variation, that continuous geographic variation, would have been less obvious because we're bringing in people from very different parts of the world. You might also notice from this map that our notions of race are kind of undersampled in terms of different zones of the world. So we often get very confused in the United States when people come from, say, India, and we see different skin tone variations, and we don't know what to do with that because that wasn't part of the colonial race system. Saudi Arabia, not always sure what to do there. Australia, sometimes I show an ethnographic film with Australian Aborigines and people are convinced we're in Africa somewhere. So we kind of undersampled the world, and we came up with these very kind of crude categories based on a limited sample of the world's population. Now, I want to bring out, one of you made a very interesting comment here that I think is important to understand, is that anthropology, the way Guest describes anthropology, and the way we like to think of anthropology, is the people who were sort of against these racist colonial ideas. However, it is important to understand that anthropology was entangled with these colonial ideas because most anthropologists came from Europe and later from the United States. And so it wasn't that they were outside of them. And in some cases, anthropologists were part of the active production of some of these ideas. So, you know, in the spirit of exposing the roots of power, we have to also reckon with the history of anthropology, which was entangled with this colonialism because they were originally, in some ways, anthropologists were originally sent out to kind of justify this colonial experience, or to say, you know, why were the people in different parts of the world the way they were? So you can look at the sending out of anthropologists from Europe and the United States as like I said, it wasn't necessarily the driver of the colonial enterprise, but in some cases it was very tightly linked. Now, I want to mention something here about the enslavement of Africans and how many people went where or were taken to other places. Because again, in the United States, we often get a strange idea of how this happened. These arrows show a kind of approximate, the sort of number, or the larger the arrow, the bigger the number of people. And, you know, a lot of people don't realize that, you know, Brazil, what is now Brazil, got almost 4 million Africans that were enslaved and taken to work in Brazil. And likewise, various islands in the Caribbean, you know, there are islands in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, what is now Haiti, that received over 1 million enslaved Africans. So there are at least 3 different islands in the Caribbean that got more enslaved Africans than the entire United States. If you look at at where people came, you know, the United States the people who were brought to what is now North America was a tiny fraction of the overall. I'm not saying it wasn't important, but we get a very strange picture in our own history of slavery because we associate with cotton plantations and, you know, and in some ways a very small importation. Most of the people who were enslaved were sent to sugar plantations, and most of them, about half almost, went to Brazil, or what is now Brazil, and into the Caribbean. I just want to point that out because it's important when we talk about the idea of what Guest talks about of how is race constructed around the world. And perhaps what he really means is how is race constructed in other parts of the Americas that were colonized in this way. And I'm not saying that that other parts of the world weren't important in colonialism, but certainly the Caribbean and South America and Brazil have a lot to teach us about different ideas about race and how it got translated into our times. And Brazil is sort of this famous anthropological case because it tells us that even in a society which is highly unequal and highly racialized, people can have very different ideas about how others should be classified. And so Brazil is a hugely important example because in Brazil, they actually often do examine someone's skin and talk about skin color in terms of, you know, some people have even said hundreds of different terms, depending on where you are. And people might even think that their skin color and their race changes over their lifetime. Some people even said that in certain towns that it would change seasonally. You know, there are families who would say that they have children of different races, even though they come from the same parents, because they look different. So it's a very different classification system, because it is very much based on physical appearance, but it also involves notions of class. There's a very famous phrase in Brazil of money whitens, so that, you know, if you can ascend it up the class ladder, you also are seen as becoming a different race. Now, this has led to some people, especially Brazilian scholars, proposing that Brazil lives in a kind of harmony and what they called a racial democracy, because they didn't mind people getting together with each other in the same way that we minded it in the United States. I put a question mark there, because that's something you want to be very careful about. For one thing, in Brazil, as in many Latin American countries, and as in the United States, although we don't always talk about it, there's a strong legacy of what is called colorism, which is, you know, that a kind of anti-blackness in which being of a darker skin color makes people, you know, there's sort of a range of variation of reaction to darkness and lightness. And, you know, there's the inequalities in Brazil are quite extreme. And it does seem to be rather, you know, sort of correspond to what we might call race. Some people in Brazil, for example, have kind of envied the social movements in the United States, because they say, well, it's easier in the United States because people are more able to identify as Black, whereas it's hard to get people to admit that in Brazil, and it's hard to get solidarity around those issues. So it's a really interesting example anthropologically. I would caution you not to sort of think it's the ideal for any of us to aspire to. Different issues, different problems. So let's turn to the United States and how we do race here. As you can guess, we do race a little bit differently in the United States than they do in Brazil. This is Halle Berry winning an Oscar in 2002. She was the big moment, because the first woman of African-American descent to win the Best Actress award. I haven't looked recently, but as of 2019, she was also the only one. So this has kind of been a disappointing moment for her, or she says in retrospect. But I give you this picture because this is before the award on the red carpet, and that's her mom. And it's her biological mother and the mother that she was raised with, both. Obviously, her father is African-American, and so that's where we get this idea that Halle Berry is African-American, because we have a strange, how to say it, our way of doing race in the United States, I don't know if it's strange, but we don't really do skin color. So we're not like the Brazilians, where they'd be examining Halle Berry's skin and saying, well, you know, she's slightly wheat colored. We basically we have an idea that actually race is based on the cultural rules associated with different kinds of blood mixtures. And I know that sounds kind of weird, because you think, nah, that's not what we do. But it is sort of what has governed over time the classification of different people in American society. It's what Guest calls, well, Guest he didn't come up with this word, it's what anthropologists call the rule of hypodescent. Basically what this means is that if there is a union between people of different races which produces offspring, then the child gets what is considered to be the inferior race, or the race is lowered. And so in American society, And, you know, remember the word, I'm putting the word lowered in quotes because that's a social evaluation. This is not an absolute evaluation. So in American society, just like we saw with Halle Berry or Barack Obama, if a white person and a black person produce an offspring, then that offspring becomes black. And, you know, the sort of the white part, at least socially, disappears. In some states, well, in many states, this was coded into law. There were legal rules about who was considered to be black or African American. So some states were sort of, they said, well, if any of your grandparents are African American, then you are, or black. Some states went to great-grandparents. Some states went down to great-great-grandparents. You see how this is going. And then the extreme sort of case of this is, you know, the Louisiana one-drop rule. If you have any African ancestry, then you're going to be considered black, which leads to some interesting things that happen in the United States, which is that, you know, some people, if they cross a state line and move to a different part of the country, depending on their biological experience, you can just say, oh, okay, well, I'm a different race now. Next time the census person comes around, they don't have to know about my great-great-grandparent. And it also means that, you know, people can go to different places in the Americas and become socially different or socially different classified as a race. As we talked about, in many countries in Latin America, in many countries in the Caribbean, many places in the Caribbean, the racial classifications can be very different. So in some Latin American countries and some parts of the Caribbean, they see it a little bit differently, where it's the rule of hyperdescent, so that you're sort of, you know, you're gradually getting a higher race than, you know, whichever parent you have. It's not necessarily a better system, because it's often seen as valuing whiteness, but it's a different system. Or in many cases, they would recognize the idea of a mixture. So in many Latin American countries, there's the idea of being mestizo, or technically of mixed race, and that is considered to be its own thing. Even in the United States, for some years in the census, we had a category of mulatto. So there would be, you know, it's a derogatory word, and it's derogatory today, but, you know, I guess we would, if we had kept that category, or a category for that in the census as its own thing, then you would say, well, you know, Halle Berry is mulatto, or Barack Obama is mulatto. You wouldn't say black. And so this happens in other places. Or like we talked about in Brazil, where you might have very different examinations of skin tone and color categories. And that's why, and sometimes people in the United States travel to other places and feel very different and perhaps freer, because there isn't a kind of polarity or a sort of dividing line or an axis that says, okay, if you're on one side of this line, you know, you live in this part of town, and you go to this place, and, you know, you sit in this place in the bus. There's a lot of different classification systems. Again, not saying that these are sort of paradises, but they're a different way of thinking about race. The other thing that happens in the United States is that we have a lot of immigration from other areas. This happens in other Latin American countries as well, but because they didn't necessarily have a rigid color line, it doesn't present the same problems as it did in the United States. And one of the problems that would happen in the United States is that, you know, people who were Irish or Italians, Greeks, Eastern Europeans, were not considered to be fully white. They were in some cases, they were too Catholic. too much garlic eating. A lot of the stereotypes that we have today, you know, about were applied to people like the Irish and the Italians. And in some cases, they were Jewish. That was not seen as, you know, as white. It's interesting. One of you in the comments said, "Well, you know, people who were visibly white back in the day, about, you know, let's say 100 years ago. Sure, 120 years ago. For example, being Irish didn't automatically mean that people saw you as visibly white. That's something that sort of, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this because it's, you know, it's so different from the way we look at the world today, but it wasn't necessarily obvious. The Irish, and to a certain extent, I guess especially the Irish, were racialized, in part because they had been colonized before by the, you know, they were a colony of the English, and so they were sort of racialized in relationship to the English in a way that was in some ways a model for later racializations. Like I said, it's almost impossible to put our heads in that space again, because you know, it's hard to imagine. I mean, you know, it's kind of like me. I mean, you know, I just check off the white box, but you know, for my grandparents and my great-grandparents, they didn't necessarily consider themselves to be white, nor did wider society consider them to be white. And so, you know, it was a very different environment, and people didn't really know what to do with these immigrants at the time. Should they be included in the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant category, or are they some sort of inferior category? There's an interesting court case. A lot of this started to get decided in the courts. And around 1910 or so, there was an interesting court case in which they said that the Armenians, who were once considered to be more Asiatic, like Asiatic Turks, the Supreme Court says that the Armenians classified as white. And so this was, you know, an interesting decision. Like I said, this was a court decision, which meant that they could then naturalize as US citizens. So there was another court decision in which Takawa Osawa made the argument, and this again went all the way to the Supreme Court, that, you know, he was of Japanese descent, and he, you know, served, I think he served in the US Army, and he was petitioning for citizenship, to be naturalized as a US citizen, and the Supreme Court decided that in that case, he was not white, and so he could not become a citizen. And so they sort of drew the line at some point in, you know, at some point to the east around, you know, so it was going to be somewhere between Armenia and Japan. And the question was, where would that line be drawn? And Gus mentions the case of Bhagat Singh Thind. And Thind actually also went to the Supreme Court, and he kind of learned from Osawa. So, you know, he saw that Osawa was kind of denied citizenship because of not being white. Thind argued that he was of, you know, he was of the Aryan race. Although, you know, he was South Asian, Indian descent, that was actually the Aryan race, and so he should be considered white. And the court said no. They said, nah, that's not going to work for us. You know, you might have science on your side, but you're not going to be white as we call white. And so we kind of drew a line around where white would be and where it wouldn't be. And it was often decided in the courts. And so if you look at our census today, you can kind of see some of these old decisions still happening in our census form. Now, this I took from the 2020 census. Everyone in the United States is supposed to have filled out this form, or in an ideal world, someone came and knocked on your door and got this information from you. And it's interesting what we want to know about people. And these questions, all of you have either had these questions answered for you, or maybe you answered them yourself. And so since this census form, actually, it's the same one, I had the great experience of being able to be one of those follow-up census takers back in the year 2000. In 2000, this is basically the way it was. And it was kind of the first way that this was done. Yes?
I was going to say what was always confusing for me, because I know like a lot of books where we talk about jobs and things like that. And apparently, like being Latino or Latina is a whole different ethnic group. But it's hard for me because I'm Puerto Rican and Black. So when you check those, or when you check like those other races, it says without, like not. Every time it says behind it says not Latino. And I don't know how to fill that out because you can't see it.
Right, okay, so great question, and that's exactly where we're going. So for those of you out there, the question is, what the heck is going on with, you know, being Latino and being of different race? And, you know, if you look at the top of this form, we're very clear about this. Now, I'm not saying this is right. Remember, none of this is right. This is just the way we do things. It says more about the US society than it does anything about what is true. It says, please answer both questions about Hispanic origin and about race. For this census, Hispanic origins are not races. And so the United States Census says, you know, hey, you don't get to say you're Mexican. You don't get to say you're Puerto Rican, not as a race. We'll say that's a ethnic question. And then you also have to check off about race. Now, this is not always true on all the forms. There are other forms that say, oh yeah, you can, that's considered to be a race. It's a kind of, how to say? Well, I would say it's a weird compromise. Remember, we don't know what to do because US society functions so long on this kind of white-black division that when people that don't really necessarily follow along the lines that we want them to, we get very confused and we start asking all kinds of other questions. So we've decided, at least the US Census has decided, that being Hispanic is not a race. It's something that you can be, and then you can be your own race. So some people would check yes, Puerto Rican, and some people would check then in box 9, Black, if you consider yourself Afro-Puerto Rican. Interestingly, at least in 2010, over half of the people who checked off yes to 8, some sort of Hispanic category, also checked off white as their race, which is interesting for a number of reasons. You know, it's hard to say, I mean, it's hard to say if that is something they consider themselves to be, which can be true. There's definitely a category of whiteness in Latin America, but it's also, you know, something that, you know, a lot of people from Latin America would consider themselves to be mestizo or of mixed race. So, you know, it's a confusing, I think it illustrates our own confusion in the United States about, well, what's going on? How come you can be from, you know, how come you can be from Cuba and be very light-skinned or very dark-skinned? Okay, well, maybe we should divide this up into 2 or 3 categories here. So yes, I think that you know, this illustrates our confusion. And then if you look at question 9, right, you have the white category. That's just one box. And then you have one box that's Black, African American, or Negro, which is, they still keep that term on the census. They've been trying to get rid of it, but they won't yet. And then if you look down under that line there, after American Indian, there's a whole bunch of boxes for Asian countries, I guess I would say. Japan, Korea, China, Philippines, Vietnam. I mean, I think I don't know if anybody from Vietnam would actually claim that Vietnamese is a race. You know what I mean? I mean, it's just like, I mean, I think you'd have to be kind of in some sort of weird, what happens there? And what I think is happening is, one, you can see where the Supreme Court drew the line. There's Bhagat Singh Thind right there with Asian Indian. We said, hey, you know, you can be white. You know, we include in the census category, you can be white if you're from Egypt, Armenia, Turkey. But as soon as you get over to India, then you have to check that other box. And I mean, you know, you have all these boxes which seem to me to be more about the political power of these countries, that we recognize them as countries than anything else. It's hard to say what exactly is going on and why the Asian countries get separate boxes, but that's what's going on. The other thing that's really interesting about, well, as one of you put it, there's so much interesting about the census. In the old days, the census taker just checked off whatever they thought the people were. You know, so you didn't even get to answer. They just said, hey, we'll see what you are. These days, you're supposed to either answer it yourself or, you know, ask the question. You don't get to just check off something for someone. In 2000 was the first year that you were allowed to mark one or more boxes. Before that, you could only mark one box. So, like I said, I had some really interesting experiences, and I was a census taker. We lived in Michigan at the time. And so the census taker goes around, and if you ever get the chance to do this, I highly recommend it. You'll learn so much about US society. So one of the first doors I knocked on, I went through my questions, and I said, well, what race do you consider yourself to be? And the woman said, well, they tell me I'm white, but I don't believe them. I know, you're all looking at me weird. And I did too. I was like, okay, well, okay. What do you want me to do? And so she actually wanted me to write in some other race, and she wanted to write in Egyptian, which again, officially in the United States, at the time, and still today, a lot of people thought that after 2001, we were going to introduce some race categories for Middle Easterners. We read about that a little bit and guessed there was definitely some interesting stuff that went on, but we did not. And so, you know, this was actually before that happened. And so the person was like, well, you know, officially I am included in the white category, but I'm going to have you write in Egyptian. So that was an interesting experience. And I went, you know, I'm going along. Some people were just, you know, easier than others, you might say. So I go to this other door, and a woman comes to the door, and I say, you know, well, what race do you consider yourselves to be? And she says, black. I say, good. And then she has a son. And I say, well, what race does your son, you know? And she says, well, his father's white. I say, well, do you want me to check off black and white? Because I can do it now, right? I got the ability. And she says, well, he's considered black. And I said, do you want me to check off black? And she said, but his father's white. And so that was hypodescent at work, right? That's why in society, he was considered black. She knew that his father was white, but out there in the world, people, well, I mean, it's not that nobody knew, but, you know, in terms of society. In that case, she actually did eventually decide, because we could, I guess, that we should check off white and black. I went down the road a little bit, a few houses down. This guy comes to the door, says, well, what race do you consider yourself to be? He says, well, part black, part white, part Indian, part Jamaican. He lists off about 6 or 7 things. I said, well, I can check them all off, you know, I can write in some stuff here. And he said, this is an interesting thing he said. He said, no way, check off black. I stand with my black sisters and brothers on this one. And so, you know, it's an interesting thing because he knew that, you know, he knew how complex race was, but he also knew that, you know, there's some sort of, there is a political statement to be made in saying, hey, in America, I'm black. You know, this means something to me. So, you know, it's a, like I said, if you ever get a chance to do this, but don't take the census too literally. We're just trying to sort boxes around because, you know, it is important to do this though, because we want to know about inequalities based on these classifications. But, you know, it also tells us something about our society. So if we summarize here what anthropology tells us, is that, you know, race is not, we're not ever going to be able to sort of sort people into these, and it's not helpful to us to say, you know, that we can categorize people by race, because in fact it is not biologically real. And again, that doesn't mean that people don't vary. They do. There's very important human variation. It just doesn't group neatly around the lines that everyone wants to draw around race. Now, it's important to realize that although race is not real, racism is, and it has very real consequences in the world. So this, what we'll talk about in the next class, institutional or structural racism has huge consequences for what kind of, you know, what kind of social chances you have in the world. And I think this is something that we sometimes leave out. It's not just consequences in terms of schooling and those kinds of things and the way you're treated. It's also going to be a biological consequence, your experience in the healthcare system, or your experience as a mother, or your experience, you know, the sort of, you know, your mortality rate. All those things are biological too. So, you know, I mean, although race does not help us, being sorted into a race by society can have a very serious biological consequences. And, you know, including, like I said, mortality rates and all those things that you don't want to have happen to you can happen. So this is where we're going to be talking about for the next class. I think that Guest is very good about having a whole sort of standalone chapter called Race and Racism. So we did, I think, the race part. We'll do racism for Wednesday. Questions, ideas, thoughts?